Nathan Whitmore raised one hand and pointed at the old man standing in the doorway of his own wedding, pointing at him the way a man points at something that should never have been let inside. "Get him out, now!" Two security guards moved before anyone in that ballroom could take a breath. The old man in the worn navy suit did not raise his voice. He did not fight. He simply pulled a small brown paper package tighter against his chest, the way a man holds the last thing on earth that still matters to him. 300 of the wealthiest guests in Connecticut watched in silence as the bride's own father was walked toward the exit. And Nathan smiled. He had no idea what he had just done. Before we go on with this story, if you believe that a person's true worth is measured by the size of their heart and never by the size of their bank account, take one moment right now to subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the very end, because what happens in the next hour will stay with you for a long time. And in the comments below, tell me the name of the city you are watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled across the world. The morning of the wedding, Michael Carter woke before the sun, the way he had woken before the sun for the last 40 years. Old habits do not leave a man just because his daughter is getting married. He made his coffee in the same chipped white mug he had used for 2 decades, and he sat at his small kitchen table, and he read the letter he had written to Emily one more time before he folded it and placed it inside the brown paper package next to his father's old pocket watch. He did not call a car service. He did not own a driver. He called the same local taxi company he always used, and when the driver arrived, the young man looked at the modest little house and then looked at Michael in his simple navy suit, and he said, "You headed somewhere special today, sir." Michael smiled and answered him quietly, "My daughter's wedding. I'm walking her down the aisle." "That's a big day," the driver said. "You must be proud." "I've been proud of her since the day she was born," Michael said. "Today is just the paperwork." The driver laughed, and the two men talked the whole way to Greenwich about the weather, about the price of gas, about the driver's own little girl who was learning to ride a bicycle. Michael listened, the way he always listened, like the man across from him was the most important person in the world, because to Michael, in that moment, he was. That was the thing about Michael Carter that nobody at the wedding would understand until it was far too late. He treated the man driving the taxi with the exact same respect he would have shown a king. He had learned a long time ago that a man's real character shows in how he speaks to people he will never see again. When the taxi pulled up to the estate, the young driver went quiet. He had never seen a house like this in his life. There were valets in white gloves. There were flower arrangements taller than a grown man. There were guests stepping out of cars that cost more than the driver would earn in 3 years of work. "You sure this is the right place, sir?" the driver asked, and there was worry in his voice, like maybe Michael had made a mistake. "This is the place," Michael said. He reached into his worn wallet and paid the fare, and then he paid it again on top, and he pressed the extra folded bills into the young man's hand and closed the driver's fingers around them. "For your little girl's bicycle." The driver's eyes filled up. "Sir, this is too much." "It's exactly enough," Michael said. "Take care of her. That's the only job that matters." And then Michael Carter stepped out of that old taxi in his simple navy suit, holding a small brown paper package, and he walked toward the grandest wedding Greenwich had seen in years, having no idea that the young man he had just helped would remember his kindness far longer than anyone inside that mansion would. The trouble started before Michael even reached the doors. A woman in a shimmering gold gown stopped him on the steps. Her name was Vivian Whitmore, and she was Nathan's mother, and she had spent the entire morning making sure that every detail of her son's wedding was perfect. She looked at Michael's shoes first. She always looked at the shoes first. And what she saw did not please her. "Excuse me," Vivian said in that voice wealthy people use when they have already decided you are beneath them. "Are you with the catering staff? The service entrance is around the side." Michael did not get angry. He never got angry at moments like this. He had lived through too many of them. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "I'm a guest." Vivian's eyebrows lifted. "A guest?" she repeated like the word tasted strange in her mouth. "And who exactly invited you?" "My daughter," Michael said. "The bride. For just 1 second, Vivian Whitmore went pale, and then she recovered because women like Vivian always recover, and she forced a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're Emily's father," she said. It was not a question, it was an accusation. "I am," Michael said. And there was warmth in his voice and pride and something that Vivian, in all her jewels and all her wealth, had never once felt in her life. "Michael Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you at last." He held out his hand. Vivian looked at it the way a person looks at something dirty, and she did not take it. She simply turned her head toward one of the coordinators and murmured, "Keep an eye on that one." And she walked away in a cloud of expensive perfume, leaving Michael Carter standing on the steps with his hand still extended and his brown paper package still held against his heart. Now here's the things you must understand, and it is the thing that would tear that entire wedding apart before the day was over. Michael was not embarrassed. He was not ashamed. He had been dismissed by people like Vivian Whitmore 1,000 times in his life, and he had learned something from every single one of them. He had learned who they truly were, and he had learned that people who judge a man by his shoes will always be judged in return by their own cruelty. Michael lowered his hand. He straightened his simple navy jacket, and he walked inside. The ballroom took his breath away, not because it was beautiful, but because he knew what it must have cost. He had built companies. He knew numbers. He looked at the flowers and the chandeliers and the mountains of imported crystal, and one quiet thought moved through his mind. My daughter is marrying a man who spends money like this to impress people he does not even like. And for the first time that morning, Michael Carter felt something cold move through his chest, because a father knows things about the men his daughter loves long before his daughter is ready to know them herself. He did not have long to think about it, because that was the moment Nathan Whitmore saw him. Nathan was standing near the front of the ballroom, surrounded by the men whose approval he had spent his entire adult life chasing. Investors, executives, board members, men with names that opened doors and closed deals. Nathan had dreamed of this day, not because he was marrying Emily, but because this was the day he finally belonged among them. He had rehearsed his handshakes. He had rehearsed his laugh. He had rehearsed the story of the humble young man who rose to greatness through sheer will, a story that left out every person who had ever helped him along the way. And then he saw an old man in a cheap navy suit walking through his perfect wedding. Nathan's smile froze. "Who," he said low to the man beside him, "is that?" The man shrugged. "No idea." Nathan set down his champagne glass. He crossed the ballroom, and every step he took his face grew harder. The old man was walking toward the front, toward where the bride would soon appear, walking like he had every right in the world to be there, and Nathan felt something rise up inside him that he did not even try to control. Because Nathan Whitmore had spent his whole life terrified of one single thing. He was terrified that someone would look at him and see underneath the tailored suit and the corporate title the poor boy he used to be. And the sight of this shabby old man walking freely through his golden wedding made that terror boil over into rage. "Excuse me." Nathan planted himself directly in Michael's path. His voice was loud enough for the nearest guests to turn. "Can I help you find the exit?" Michael looked at the young man in front of him, the young man his daughter loved, and he studied his face the way he had studied 1,000 faces across a boardroom table. And he did not like what he saw, but he answered kindly anyway, because he still believed in that moment that he owed this man a chance. "You must be Nathan," Michael said, and he extended his hand a second time that day. "I'm Michael, Emily's father. I've been looking forward to meeting you." The ballroom around them began to quiet. Guests sensed something. Wealthy people can always sense conflict the way animals sense a storm coming. Nathan looked at the extended hand. He looked at the worn cuff of the navy jacket. He looked at the brown paper package wrapped in cheap string clutched in the old man's other hand. And Nathan Whitmore laughed, out loud, in front of everyone. "You're her father," he said. "You looking like that, Nathan," Michael said quietly, and his hand was still out. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere private." "Private?" Nathan's voice climbed. No, I don't think so. Do you have any idea what today cost me? Do you have any idea who is in this room? These are the most important people in the state of Connecticut. And you show up looking like you crawled out of a bus station carrying what is that garbage?" He gestured at the package. "Is that your gift? A brown paper bag?" A few of the guests laughed nervously. Most did not. Most had gone very still because most of them could feel that they were watching something ugly happen and they did not know how to stop it. Michael slowly lowered his hand for the second time that day. "Nathan," he said, and his voice never rose, not even a little. "This package holds a letter I wrote to my daughter and my own father's pocket watch. It is the most valuable thing I own, and I did not come here to impress anyone. I came here to walk Emily down the aisle." "Walk her down the aisle." Nathan said it like the words disgusted him. "You want to stand up there in front of my investors, in front of my board looking like that? Absolutely not. Do you understand what people would think? They would think I married into this." He waved his hand up and down at Michael's suit. "I have spent years building an image, years, and I will not let you tear it down in a single afternoon." And now the ballroom was truly silent. 300 people were watching a groom scream at an old man on the happiest day of his life, and not one of them said a word. That was when Emily's mother stepped forward. Diane Carter had been Michael's wife for 32 years. She knew things about her husband that not one person in that room knew. And she had stayed quiet all morning because Emily had begged her to keep the peace, because Emily wanted this day to be perfect. But there is a limit to what a mother can watch in silence. "Nathan," Diane's voice cut through the ballroom, "that is my husband you are speaking to. That is Emily's father. You will apologize to him this instant." Nathan turned on her, and here is where the whole room saw who he truly was. Because a man reveals his character not in how he treats the powerful, but in how he treats the people he believes cannot hurt him. "Apologize," Nathan said. "Diane, with all due respect, look at him. Look at both of you. I have carried this family up the ladder. I have opened doors for Emily that she never could have opened herself. And this is how you repay me, by dragging some relic into my wedding to embarrass me in front of everyone I have worked to impress." Diane's face went white with fury. "You arrogant little boy," she whispered. "You have no idea. You have no idea who you are talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Nathan snapped. "A woman who married a nobody, and I am not going to let a nobody ruin the most important day of my life." And then Nathan Whitmore made the decision that would cost him everything he had ever built. He turned toward the back of the ballroom and he lifted his hand and he called out in a voice that carried to every corner of that gilded room, "Security! I need security up front, now!" 2 men in dark suits appeared almost instantly, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath at once. "Nathan, don't do this," Diane said, and there was fear in her voice now, not for Michael, but for Nathan, because she could see the cliff he was about to walk off, and he could not. "I am begging you, do not do this." Michael put a gentle hand on his wife's arm. "It's all right, Diane," he said softly. "Let him." "Michael, no." "Let him," Michael said again. And he looked at Nathan, and there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before. Not anger, not hurt. Something far worse for Nathan than either of those things. There was a quiet, final kind of understanding, the look of a man who has finished making up his mind. Let him show everyone exactly who he is. The security guards reached them. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, clearly did not want to be there. He looked at Nathan, and he looked at the harmless old man in the Navy suit, and his voice was uncertain. "Sir, what's the situation?" "The situation," Nathan said, "is that this man is trespassing at a private event, and I want him removed immediately." "He's the bride's father," the older guard said slowly. "I don't care if he's the president," Nathan said. "Get him out." And here is the moment. Here is the exact moment that 300 of the most powerful people in Connecticut would spend the rest of their lives talking about. The older guard hesitated, but the younger one stepped forward and put a hand on Michael's shoulder, and the whole room flinched at the same time, and someone, a woman near the front, let out a small cry, and still nobody moved to stop it. Michael did not resist. He did not jerk away. He looked at the young guard's hand on his shoulder, and then he looked up at the young man's face, and he said gently, the way a grandfather speaks to a child, "It's all right, son. You're just doing your job. I don't hold it against you." The young guard's hand loosened, because in all his years of removing people from places no one had ever thanked him for it. But Nathan was not finished. Oh, Nathan was not nearly finished. "Get moving!" Nathan barked. Walk him out, and take that garbage with him." He pointed at the brown paper package, and now Michael Carter turned his head, and for the first time all day, something flickered in his eyes that made the men closest to him take a small step back without knowing why. Because there is a certain kind of stillness that dangerous men carry, and it has nothing to do with the price of their suit. Michael looked at Nathan, and he spoke very, very quietly. "You can walk me out of this room, Nathan," he said. "You can put your hands on me and drag me into the street, but you will not call my father's watch garbage. Not today, not ever. That watch was on my father's wrist the day he died, and a man who cannot tell the difference between a cheap suit and a priceless heart is a man who will lose everything he has built. Mark my words. You will lose it all, and you will lose it because of this exact moment, right here." For one heartbeat, Nathan Whitmore felt something. A chill, a whisper of doubt, some ancient animal instinct that told him he had just stepped on something that was going to bite back. But he was too proud to listen to it. Pride is a wall that keeps warnings out right up until the moment it collapses and buries the man who built it. "Get him out of my sight," Nathan said, and they did. The whole ballroom watched as the bride's own father was walked calmly and without a single word of protest out of the wedding, past the towers of flowers, past the champagne, past 300 silent guests who would remember every second of it for the rest of their lives. Some of them looked away in shame. A few of the older men who had built their own fortunes from nothing and knew exactly what it meant to be judged by your clothes, watched Michael go with something like respect, because there is a dignity in a man who refuses to lose his temper, even while he is being humiliated, and they saw it even if Nathan could not. At the doors, Michael stopped. He turned around one last time, and he did something that made the entire ballroom go cold. He smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not a broken smile. It was the calm, patient smile of a man who knows something that everyone else in the room has not yet figured out. And he looked at Nathan Whitmore across all that distance, and he tipped his head just slightly, almost like a bow, almost like a promise. And then he was gone. The doors closed behind him. And in the silence that followed, one old investor near the front, a silver-haired man named Harold Bishop, who had made and lost 3 fortunes in his lifetime, leaned over to the man beside him and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I have seen that look before, on the face of men who were about to end other men. I don't know who that was, but God help this boy." Nathan did not hear him. Nathan was already turning back to his guests, already forcing his smile back onto his face, already lifting his champagne glass as if nothing at all had happened. "My apologies for the disruption, everyone," he announced smoothly. "A small misunderstanding. Now, where were we? Let's get this celebration back on track." A few guests clapped uncertainly, most did not, and Diane Carter stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, staring at the closed doors where her husband had just disappeared, and her hands were shaking, and one single tear rolled down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. Because Diane knew. Diane knew what her husband had done for 30 years. She knew the taxis and the chipped coffee mug and the modest little house were a choice, not a circumstance. She knew that the man Nathan had just thrown into the street had 3 decades earlier built one of the largest infrastructure companies in the entire country from nothing but a borrowed truck and a refusal to ever quit. She knew that Michael Carter had spent his whole life hiding his wealth for one simple, beautiful reason. He wanted to raise a daughter who knew the value of a person's heart, not the value of their portfolio. And she knew, standing there in that ballroom full of strangers, that Nathan Whitmore had just insulted, humiliated, and physically removed the single most powerful man any of them had ever been in a room with. And Nathan Whitmore worked for him. Nathan Whitmore had worked for the last 6 years at a company he did not even realize was owned from the shadows by the very man he had just called garbage and dragged into the street. Diane pressed her hand to her mouth, and through her tears something that was almost a laugh escaped her, a terrible, disbelieving sound, because part of her wanted to warn Nathan, wanted to stop the freight train she could see coming, and part of her, a part she was not proud of, wanted to watch it hit him at full speed. She did not have to decide, because upstairs at that very moment, in a room full of mirrors and flowers, and a wedding dress that had cost more than most people earned in a year, Emily Carter was about to receive a text message that would end everything. Now outside the mansion, Michael Carter walked slowly down the long drive, past the valets and the expensive cars, and he did not look back a second time. He walked to the old oak trees at the edge of the property, the ones that had stood there for 200 years long before the Whitmores and their money. And he sat down on a low stone wall and he set the brown paper package gently on his knees. And for a long moment, Michael Carter, founder and chairman of one of the most valuable companies in America, a man who could have bought that entire estate 100 times over, without blinking, simply sat alone in a borrowed suit and looked at the letter he had written to his little girl. He was not angry. That was the thing that people always misunderstood about Michael. He was not a man who lived for revenge. Revenge was a young man's game, and Michael had learned long ago that it burned the man who carried it as badly as it burned the man it was aimed at. No, Michael was not angry. He was disappointed. He was disappointed because for the last 2 years he had watched his daughter fall in love with a man he did not trust, and he had said nothing because a father who tells his grown daughter who to love only pushes her further into the arms of the wrong man. He had waited. He had prayed. He had hoped that he was wrong about Nathan Whitmore, hoped that beneath the ambition and the polish there was a decent heart. And today, in the space of 5 minutes, Nathan had answered every question Michael had ever had about him. And the answer broke Michael's heart, not for himself, but for Emily. "Well, Dad," Michael murmured out loud to the old pocket watch in his lap, the way he sometimes still spoke to his father even though the man had been gone for 40 years. "Looks like I was right about him. I sure wish I hadn't been." He opened the small package. He took out the watch. He held it in his palm, and he felt its familiar weight, the weight of a man's whole life pressed into a small, round piece of gold. And he ran his thumb across the worn engraving on the back. 3 words his father had put there, the same 3 words Michael had built his entire life around. Character over comfort. His father had been a bricklayer, a poor, honest, hard-working bricklayer who had never owned a suit finer than the one Michael wore right now, and who had raised a son to understand that the measure of a man is not what he accumulates, but what he refuses to compromise. Michael had taken those 3 words and turned them into an empire. And then he had spent the second half of his life pretending the empire did not exist, driving old cars, eating at the same small diner, letting the world underestimate him all, so that he could watch quietly who treated him with kindness when they believed he had nothing to give. Most people failed that test. Nathan had failed it spectacularly. And Michael sat under those old oak trees, and he thought about all of it, and then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and for the first time all day, something shifted in Michael Carter's face. The disappointment was still there, but underneath it something else had woken up, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, something that the men who had built their fortunes beside him back in the early days would have recognized instantly and been very, very afraid of. Because the name on the screen was Reginald Simmons. Reginald Simmons, the chief financial officer of Whitmore Global Holdings. A man who had worked at Michael's side for 25 years, a man who knew every secret of the company, every account, every file, including a file that had been quietly building for the last 2 years, a file with Nathan Whitmore's name on it. Michael looked at the phone for a long moment. He thought about Emily. He thought about the letter. He thought about his father's 3 words. And then he pressed the button and lifted the phone to his ear, and he said very quietly, in a voice that had once made grown executives sit up straight in their chairs, "Reggie." "Michael." Reginald's voice was tight. "I just heard. One of the coordinators called me. Is it true? Did that boy actually have you thrown out?" "He did," Michael said. There was a silence on the line, a long one. And when Reginald spoke again, his voice had changed. It had gone very cold and very steady, the voice of a man who has been waiting a long time for a phone call, exactly like this one. "Michael, you have been protecting that young man for 2 years. You told me to give him chances. You told me to wait to see if he'd grow, to see if he'd become the kind of man Emily deserved. Well, I think we have our answer." "I think we do," Michael said. "So what do you want me to do?" And Michael Carter looked out at the grand estate where his daughter's wedding was falling apart. And he looked down at his father's pocket watch resting in his weathered palm. And he thought about the young taxi driver and the little girl learning to ride her bicycle. And he thought about all the people in his life who had shown him kindness when they believed he was nobody. And all the people like Nathan who had shown him contempt for the very same reason. And he made his decision. "Reggie," Michael said softly, "I think it's time." He could hear Reginald Simmons draw in a slow breath on the other end of the line, the breath of a man who understood exactly what those 4 words meant, because the two of them had spoken about this day for 2 years in careful private conversations, always ending with Michael saying, "Not yet, not yet, give him one more chance." And now at last, there were no more chances left to give. "Are you certain?" Reginald asked. "Once I walk through those doors, Michael, there's no undoing it. That boy's whole world comes down. His career, his reputation, everything. There is no going back." Michael closed his hand around the watch. "He put his hands on me and called my father's memory garbage," Michael said, and his voice was gentle, but there was iron underneath it now, iron that had been hidden under a borrowed Navy suit all afternoon. "He screamed at my wife. He humiliated my daughter's family in front of 300 people. And Reggie, he did all of it because he thought I was a poor old man who could not hurt him. He showed me exactly who he is when he believes there is nothing to gain. So no, I'm not going to give him another chance. I gave him 2 years of chances. Now I am going to give him the truth." "And Emily?" Reginald asked quietly. "What about Emily?" At the sound of his daughter's name, the iron in Michael's voice softened just for a moment into something that ached. "Emily is stronger than she knows," he said. "She just needs to see the truth with her own eyes. Sometimes the kindest thing a father can do is let his child watch the truth arrive on its own 2 feet, instead of trying to carry it to them himself." He paused. "How long until you can be here?" "I'm already in the car," Reginald said. "I've been in the car since the coordinator called me. Michael, I have never stopped hoping this day would never come. But I have never stopped preparing for it either. I have the file with me. Everything. The complaints, the reports, every single thing that boy has done to the people he thought were beneath him, all the ones who were too afraid to speak up because he had power over their jobs. It's all here, on the seat beside me." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Bring it," he said. "Bring all of it. But Reggie, listen to me. We are not doing this out of revenge. Do you understand me? A man who tears down his enemies out of anger is no better than the man he's tearing down. We are doing this because there are good people in that company who have been hurt by that boy, people who could not defend themselves, and it is our job, it has always been our job to defend the people who cannot defend themselves. That is why we built the company. That is the only reason it was ever worth building." "I understand," Reginald said, and then softer, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Wait for me." "I'll be here," Michael said. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got nothing but time and an old watch and a letter for my daughter." And he hung up the phone. He sat there under the oak trees. And upstairs, 3 floors above the ballroom, Emily Carter was staring at her phone with her whole body gone cold. The text had come from her cousin who was downstairs among the guests. 4 words. "Nathan had your dad removed." And below it, a second text arriving even as Emily read the first. "Security walked him out. Everyone saw. It was awful." Emily read the words 3 times. Then she read them a 4th. And each time her mind refused to make sense of them because they described a thing so cruel, so impossible, that surely there had been some mistake. "That's not right," she said aloud to the empty room, to the mirrors, to the beautiful dress she was wearing. "That's not Nathan wouldn't. He wouldn't do that." But even as she said it, some deeper part of her, some part she had been quietly silencing for 2 years, whispered back, "Yes, he would. You have always known he would. You just did not want to see it." Emily thought about all the small things, the way Nathan looked down on the waiters at restaurants, the way he spoke to the doorman like the man was furniture, the way he had asked her more than once if her father really had to come to the wedding, looking well the way her father looked. She had made excuses for all of it. Love makes excellent excuses. Love is the best lawyer a bad man ever had. But there were no excuses for this. Emily stood up. Her bridesmaids were fussing at the hem of her dress, and one of them, her closest friend Claire, looked up and saw Emily's face and immediately went still. "Em," Claire said carefully. "Em, what's wrong? You've gone white as a sheet." Emily looked at her friend, and her voice when it came out was very quiet and very steady, and it frightened Claire more than screaming ever could have. "Nathan had my father thrown out of the wedding," she said. "By security, in front of everyone." The room went silent. All the bridesmaids froze. "He did what?" Claire whispered. "He had my father," Emily repeated, and now her voice was starting to shake, but not with sadness. "The man who raised me, the man who worked 2 jobs so I could go to college, the kindest man I have ever known in my entire life, dragged out of my wedding like a criminal because he did not like the way my father was dressed." "Emily," Claire reached for her. "Emily, sit down. Let's think about this. Let's not." "No." Emily pulled the veil off her own head and dropped it on the floor. "No. I am done thinking about it. I have spent 2 years thinking and making excuses, and telling myself he would change, and telling myself the good outweighed the bad. And you know what, Claire? You know what I just realized, standing here in this ridiculous dress that Nathan picked out because he said the one I loved wasn't expensive enough." Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. "I realize my father tried to warn me, not with words. My dad never once told me who to marry. But he tried to warn me by watching, by waiting, by being patient. And I ignored him. I ignored the best man I've ever known because I was chasing something Nathan made me believe I wanted." "Emily, where are you going?" Claire said, because Emily had turned toward the door. "I'm going downstairs," Emily said, "and I am going to look Nathan Whitmore in the eye, and then I am going to go find my father." "You can't go down there like this. The ceremony hasn't." "There isn't going to be a ceremony," Emily said, and she walked out the door in her wedding dress, and her bridesmaids stood frozen behind her, and downstairs in a ballroom full of the most powerful people in Connecticut. Nathan Whitmore was laughing with an investor entirely unaware that his bride was coming down the stairs, entirely unaware that a black car was already turning into the estate's long drive. Entirely unaware that his chief financial officer sat in the back of that car with a file on his lap that was about to end his career, and entirely unaware that the poor old man he had thrown into the street was sitting calmly beneath the oak trees, holding a golden watch that said, "Character over comfort," waiting with all the patience in the world for the truth to arrive on its own 2 feet. Emily reached the top of the grand staircase, and she stopped. And for one moment, she looked down at the whole glittering scene below her, the flowers, the crystal, the champagne, the 300 faces, the whole expensive world Nathan had built to prove he was somebody, and she saw it for the very first time exactly as her father had seen it when he walked in that morning. She saw that none of it was real. She saw that a man who needs a room like this to feel like he matters is a man who has never once felt like he matters at all. And she understood in that single frozen moment at the top of the stairs that her father had tried to teach her this lesson her whole life, gently, patiently, by driving an old car and living in a modest home and treating taxi drivers like kings, and she had almost missed it. But she had not missed it. Not quite. Emily Carter lifted the front of her wedding dress in both hands, and she began to walk down the stairs toward the man she was supposed to marry, and every guest who saw her face knew instantly that something was about to happen that no amount of money in that room could stop. At the bottom of the stairs, Nathan finally turned. He saw his bride descending toward him, and he smiled that practiced camera-ready smile, and he opened his arms as if to welcome her, as if nothing were wrong, as if he had not just thrown her father into the street. "There she is!" Nathan called out loud enough for the investors to hear, playing the role of the adoring groom. "There's my beautiful bride." Emily reached the bottom of the stairs. She walked straight up to him. The whole ballroom watched, and she stopped just close enough that only the nearest guests could hear the first thing she said, though what came after would be heard by every single person in that room. "Where?" Emily said in a voice that trembled with a fury Nathan had never once heard from her in 2 years. "Is my father?" And Nathan Whitmore's practiced smile began very slowly to fall apart. Where is my father? Emily's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, and for the first time in 2 years, Nathan Whitmore did not have an answer ready. He recovered fast. He always recovered fast. That was the thing about Nathan, the thing that had carried him up the ladder faster than men, twice his talent. He could take a punch to the gut and smile through it before anyone saw the pain. "Emily, sweetheart," he said, reaching for her hands. "You're upset, I understand, but this is our day and there was a small situation that I handled and now it's over. And we can—" "Don't." Emily pulled her hands back before he could touch them. "Don't you dare call me sweetheart. Where is my father, Nathan? I asked you a question and 300 people are waiting to hear how you answer it." The nearest guests had gone dead silent. Word was already rippling backward through the ballroom, guest to guest, whisper to whisper. The bride is confronting the groom. "Something's happening at the front. Look, look." And Nathan felt all those eyes landing on him, all those important eyes, all the investors and board members and old money he had spent his entire life trying to impress, and he made the second catastrophic mistake of the day. He decided to save face instead of saving his marriage. "Your father," Nathan said, lowering his voice, but not enough, never enough, showed up to a $200,000 wedding looking like he crawled out of a shelter. "I have a reputation, Emily. We have a reputation. And I was not going to let one man's poor judgment about how to dress embarrass us in front of everyone who matters. Everyone who matters." Emily repeated the words, slowly tasting them, like she was hearing them for the very first time, even though she had heard Nathan say versions of them 100 times before. "Everyone who matters. Nathan, do you hear yourself? My father is the only person in this entire room who has ever mattered to me, and you had him dragged out like garbage." "I had him escorted out," Nathan corrected, and his jaw was tightening now, his charm cracking at the edges because Nathan did not like being questioned, especially not in public, especially not by a woman he had convinced himself he was doing a favor by marrying. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Emily said. "Because my cousin texted me that 2 men in suits put their hands on a 62-year-old man and walked him out the door while 300 people watched and did nothing. Which part of that is escorting Nathan? Which part of that is you being the good man you keep telling everyone you are?" A murmur moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, an older woman said, not quietly enough, "Good for her." Nathan heard it. His face flushed red. And now the fear that lived underneath all his ambition, the terror of being seen as the poor boy he used to be, the terror of losing the crowd's approval, twisted itself into anger because that was the only way Nathan knew how to survive fear. He attacked. "You want to do this here?" he hissed. "In front of everyone. Fine. Let's do it. Your father, Emily, has been a drag on this family since the day I met him. The old car, the tiny house, the refusal to let me help him. Do you know how many times I offered that man money? Do you know how many times I offered to buy him a decent suit, get him a real car, move him into a place he wouldn't be ashamed of, and every single time he said no? No, thank you, Nathan. I'm fine, Nathan," because he'd rather cling to his pride than let his own daughter's fiancé lift him up. "He said no," Emily said, and something was happening to her voice now, a terrible cold clarity, "because he was never ashamed, Nathan, not once in his whole life. You were ashamed. You were ashamed of him. You wanted to fix him because you couldn't stand that he existed." "I wanted to help him. You wanted to hide him." Emily's voice rose, and it carried now to every corner of the ballroom, and nobody even pretended not to listen anymore. "You wanted to dress him up so your investors wouldn't know where I came from. Well, guess what, Nathan? I know where I come from. I come from a man who worked 2 jobs so I could have shoes that fit. I come from a man who never once raised his voice at me in 26 years. I come from a man who taught me that you can tell everything about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them." She took a breath and it shook. "And I just watched you fail that test in front of the whole world." For a moment, nobody spoke. And then from the middle of the crowd, a voice, Diane Carter, Emily's mother, who had been standing frozen since the moment her husband was walked out, stepped forward now, and her face was streaked with tears she had not bothered to wipe, but her spine was straight as a rod. "Emily's right," Diane said. "And Nathan, I am going to say something now, and I want every single person in this room to hear it, because you all watched what happened and you all stayed silent, and I will not stay silent for one more second." She turned in a slow circle, taking in the crowd, the flowers, the crystal, the whole gilded lie of it. "You threw the wrong man out today, Nathan. You have no idea. You have no earthly idea what you just did." "Diane," Nathan started, with respect. "Don't you respect me?" Diane's voice cracked like a whip. "You have never respected a single person in this room who couldn't advance your career. I watched you do it for 2 years. I watched you charm the men with money and ignore the women who serve the food. I watched you learn the names of every executive and never once learn the name of my husband's oldest friend. And I said nothing because my daughter loved you, and I hoped God help me. I hoped you would grow into a better man." Her voice broke and she let it break. "But you're not going to grow, are you? You've been throwing away good people your whole life. You just never threw one out in front of 300 witnesses before." Nathan's eyes darted around the room. He could feel the crowd shifting. He could feel it the way a man in the water feels the current change direction underneath him. These people, his people, the ones he'd bled to impress, were not on his side. They were watching him drown, and some of them, he could see it. Some of them were enjoying it. He needed to take control back, fast. "All right," Nathan said, forcing his voice into something calm and reasonable, spreading his hands like a man surrounded by hysterics. "All right, everyone needs to take a breath. Emily, you're emotional, and that's understandable. Weddings are stressful, and I made a call in the moment that maybe came across harsher than I intended. If your father is still on the property, I will personally go find him and apologize. Okay, is that what you want? I'll apologize to him." "You'll apologize to him?" Emily let out a laugh that had no humor in it at all. Now that 300 people are watching you look like a monster, now you'll apologize. You wouldn't apologize 5 minutes ago when you thought you'd gotten away with it. That's not remorse, Nathan. That's damage control." And that was the exact moment precisely then that the great doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. Every head turned. A man walked in. He was not dressed like Michael Carter had been dressed. He was wearing a suit that even the wealthiest men in that room recognized instantly as the kind of suit you did not buy off a rack, the kind that was measured and cut and made by hands that only served a very small number of very serious people. His shoes gleamed. His silver hair was cut close and clean, and he walked into that ballroom like he owned the ground under his own feet, because men who have real power do not have to announce it. They simply arrive and the room rearranges itself around them. The whispers started immediately. "Is that Reginald Simmons? That's the CFO of Whitmore Global." "That's Simmons. That's actually Simmons. What is he doing here?" Nathan heard the name ripple through the crowd, and his heart leapt because in the chaos of the moment, his desperate mind seized on the wrong idea entirely. He thought the cavalry had arrived. He thought a powerful ally had come to rescue him, come to lend the weight of the company's second most powerful executive to his side of the argument. Reginald Simmons here at his wedding. Surely this could only help. Nathan practically ran across the ballroom toward him. "Mr. Simmons!" His voice was bright with relief. "Mr. Simmons, what an incredible honor. I had no idea you were coming. This means the world to me, truly." He stuck out his hand. Reginald Simmons looked down at the hand, and he did not take it. He looked at Nathan, the way a man looks at something he has finally caught after tracking it for a very long time. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet and level, and it reached every corner of the silent room. "I know exactly who you are, Nathan," Reginald said. Nathan's smile flickered. Of course, sir. We've met at the—" "I know exactly what you are," Reginald continued as if Nathan had not spoken. "I have known for quite some time, and I want you to understand something before this goes any further. I did not come here as a guest. I was not invited to your wedding. I came here because I received a phone call 20 minutes ago from a man I have worked beside for 25 years, and that man asked me to come." A phone call? Nathan's mind raced. From who? Reginald did not answer him. Instead, he turned. He turned toward the great doors he had just walked through, and he faced them, and he waited. and every single person in that ballroom turned to look where he was looking, 300 pairs of eyes swinging toward the entrance all at once. And the whispering died completely, and the silence became so total that Emily could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. And then through the doors, walking slowly calmly in the same worn navy suit he had worn all day, holding the same small brown paper package he had held all day, came Michael Carter. Emily made a sound, a broken, joyful, disbelieving sound, half a sob and half a laugh. "Daddy!" Michael's eyes found hers across the whole enormous room, and for a moment, just a moment, nothing else in that ballroom existed. Not the crowd, not Nathan, not the crystal or the flowers, nothing but a father and his daughter looking at each other. And Michael smiled at her, the same gentle smile he had smiled at her every day of her life. And Emily understood in that instant that no matter what happened next, no matter what the truth turned out to be, her father was safe, and he had come back, and he had come back for her. Nathan looked from Michael to Reginald to Michael again, and his mind still had not caught up. It refused to catch up, because the thing it was being asked to understand was too large, too impossible, too catastrophic to fit inside the story Nathan had told himself about his own life. Nathan stammered. "Mr. Simmons, I'm confused, that man. He was just a..." Reginald Simmons held up one hand and Nathan fell silent. And then Reginald Simmons did the thing that would end Nathan Whitmore's entire world. He walked across the ballroom to Michael Carter. He stopped in front of him, and in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the state of Connecticut, in front of the investors and the board members and the old money Reginald Simmons, chief financial officer of Whitmore Global Holdings, bowed his head slightly, and he said in a clear voice that carried to every last corner of that room, "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. I came the moment you called." The silence shattered into 100 gasps. Reginald turned to face the crowd. He put a hand gently on Michael's shoulder, and he said the words that Nathan Whitmore would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "Ladies and gentlemen, many of you know me. Fewer of you know the man standing beside me because he has spent 30 years making very sure of that. So allow me to introduce him properly." He paused. "This is Michael Carter, the founder, the majority owner, and the chairman of the board of Whitmore Global Holdings." The room did not just gasp. The room came apart. A woman dropped her champagne glass, and it shattered on the marble, and nobody even looked. An investor near the front stood straight up out of his chair. Voices erupted everywhere at once. "The founder, he's the founder. That's the founder, the man." They threw out, "is the founder," and through all of it, one voice, Harold Bishop, the silver-haired old man who had made and lost 3 fortunes and had watched Michael walk out that morning with a chill down his spine, said to no one and everyone, I told you, God help this boy." And Nathan Whitmore stood alone in the center of it all, and every drop of color drained from his face. "No," he said. It came out as barely a whisper. "No, that's not possible." He looked at Michael. He looked at the worn navy suit, the same suit he had mocked, the same suit he had used as his justification for throwing a man into the street. He looked at the cheap taxi he had scoffed at through the window. He looked at the brown paper package he had called garbage, and the entire foundation of his understanding of the world cracked straight down the middle. "You," Nathan said, and his voice was shaking now, You can't be the founder of Whitmore Global. He's a recluse. He's never at the office. He's never at a single event. I don't come to the office," Michael said, and it was the first time he had spoken since walking back through those doors, and his voice was calm and quiet, and it silenced the entire room. "Because I built that company to run without me leaning on it. I don't come to events because I have no interest in being flattered by people who only smile at me because of what I own. And I have spent 30 years driving old cars and living in a small house and dressing exactly the way I am dressed right now for one single reason, Nathan." Michael took a step toward him. "So that I could see," he said, "who people really are before they find out what I have." Nathan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You want to know the funny thing?" Michael continued, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a deep and terrible sadness. "I have watched you for 2 years, not as your chairman. You never knew who I was, but I read the reports. I heard the stories. Reggie brought them to me again and again and again and again. I told him to wait, give the boy time, maybe he'll grow. Maybe my daughter sees something in him that I'm missing. I defended you, Nathan. To the one man in that company who wanted you gone, I defended you. For 2 years, because you were going to marry my little girl, and I wanted more than anything in this world for you to be a good man. He stopped in front of Nathan close now, and his eyes were wet, but his voice never wavered. And this morning, Michael said, I gave you the last test. I walked into your wedding as a poor old man, and I gave you one final chance to show me that underneath all that ambition, there was a decent heart. All you had to do, Nathan, all you had to do was shake my hand, welcome me, treat a stranger in a cheap suit with a little bit of kindness. That's all. That was the whole test. Michael's voice dropped to almost nothing. And you had 2 security guards throw me into the street. The silence in that ballroom was the loudest thing anyone there had ever heard. Nathan's legs felt like they were going to give out. He reached out and grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. His mind was screaming at him to do something, say something, fix this. But there was nothing to fix. There was no version of the last 20 minutes he could talk his way out of. Every powerful person he had ever wanted to impress was standing right here watching as he learned that he had physically assaulted and publicly humiliated the man who signed every paycheck he had ever received. Mr. Carter, Nathan finally choked out. Sir, please, you have to understand I didn't know if I had known who you were. And there it was. Michael's face, which had been so full of sorrow, went suddenly still. If you had known who I was, Michael repeated softly. Yes, sir. Of course, if I had known, I would never have. I would have treated you with the utmost. That, Michael said, is exactly the problem. He looked at Nathan, and now there was something like pity in his eyes, the kind of pity you feel for a man who is standing at the edge of a cliff he cannot see. You just told me in front of everyone, Michael said, that your kindness depends on what a person can do for you, that you would have bowed and scraped if you'd known I owned the company, but a poor old man deserved to be thrown into the street. You think that's a defense, Nathan. You think that makes it better. But it's the whole indictment. It's everything. A man who is only kind to people who are useful to him is not a kind man. He's a calculating one. And I would rather hand my company to a stranger off the street than to a man who measures every human being by what they can give him. Emily was crying now, openly, one hand pressed over her mouth, but she was not crying for Nathan. She crossed the room to her father, her wedding dress dragging across the marble, and she stopped in front of him, and Michael opened his arms, and she fell into them, and he held his daughter the way he had held her when she was 5 years old and frightened of a thunderstorm. I'm so sorry, Daddy, she whispered into his shoulder. I'm so sorry I didn't listen. You tried to tell me you tried for 2 years and I didn't. Shh, Michael murmured, stroking her hair. You listened today. That's what matters. You listened when it counted. I almost married him, but you didn't. Michael pulled back and looked at her, and he brushed a tear off her cheek with his thumb the same way he had 1,000 times. You didn't, sweetheart. You saw him, and seeing clearly, even a little late, is a gift most people never get in their whole lives. Emily nodded against his hand, and then she straightened up. She wiped her own eyes, and she turned around to face Nathan, and the softness was gone from her face, replaced by something her father recognized because it was his own steel passed down. She reached up, she took hold of her engagement ring, and in front of every single person in that ballroom, she pulled it off her finger. Emily? Nathan said, a panic flooding his voice. Emily, no, wait, we can fix this. I love you. You know I love you. You don't love me, Nathan, Emily said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to every ear in the room. You love what marrying me was going to get you. You just found out 5 minutes ago exactly how much that was, and I watched your face do the math. She held the ring up so the light caught it. You want to know the truth? You never once asked me about my father's company because you never once imagined he had one. You thought you were marrying up by marrying down. You thought you were doing me a favor. And the whole time, my father was worth more than every guest in this room combined, and he never told you because he wanted to know if you'd love his daughter without the money. She walked to the nearest table. She set the ring down on the white linen gently, deliberately. He got his answer, Emily said. And so did I. She turned her back on Nathan Whitmore and walked back to her father's side. Nathan stood there staring at the ring on the table, and something in him broke, and out of that broken place came the ugliest thing yet, because desperate men cornered men. Men who have lost everything in the space of a single afternoon will sometimes reach for cruelty as their very last weapon. "You know what?" Nathan said, and his voice had turned poisonous. "Fine. Keep your ring. Keep your $200,000 wedding that I paid for. But let's all be honest about what's really happening here." He looked around at the crowd, at the investors, at the board members playing to them one final desperate time. "The old man is rich, great, wonderful. But you all saw him this morning, too. You all saw the suit, the taxi, the paper bag. Don't stand there and pretend any of you would have treated him any differently than I did. Every single one of you judged that man the second he walked in. I'm just the only one honest enough to have acted on it." For one terrible moment it landed. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably because there was a splinter of truth in it, and they knew it, and they did not like being reminded. And that was when Reginald Simmons stepped forward again, and this time he was holding a file. "You're right, Nathan," Reginald said. "People judged him this morning. That's human. That's a flaw we all carry." He opened the file. But there's a difference between a flaw and a pattern. There's a difference between a moment of poor judgment and a documented history of abusing your power over people who couldn't fight back. And that difference, Nathan, is what's in this folder. Nathan went very still. "What's in the folder?" he said. "Complaints," Reginald said. 23 of them over the last 4 years. From assistants, from junior analysts, from the cleaning staff, from the mailroom, from a receptionist. You got fired for correcting you in front of a client. He turned a page. "A woman named Rosa in the third-floor break room, who you called stupid in front of 6 witnesses because she brought you the wrong coffee. A 24-year-old intern named David, who you made cry, who quit finance entirely and moved back to Ohio. A man named Terrence in the parking structure who you screamed at for 3 full minutes because he asked you to move your car out of a reserved spot that wasn't yours." Each name landed like a stone. "Every one of these people," Reginald continued, "was afraid to file formally because you had power over them, and they had families, and they couldn't afford to make an enemy of a rising executive. So they told their supervisors quietly, and their supervisors documented it quietly, and it all came to me, and I brought it to the chairman." He nodded toward Michael. "And do you know what he said, Nathan, every single time he said, 'Give the boy a chance'? He might grow. My daughter loves him. Give him time." Reginald closed the file. "He gave you 2 years of time," Reginald said. "He gave you every chance a man could give. And you spent that time exactly the way you spent this morning, stepping on everyone you thought was beneath you and bowing to everyone you thought was above you. The only difference is that this morning you finally did it to the wrong person in front of the right witnesses." Nathan's face had gone gray. "You can't," he said. "You can't use that. Those are internal HR matters. Those are confidential. You can't just—" "You're right," Reginald said. "I can't fire you over dinner party gossip. But I can convene a full review of every documented complaint effective Monday morning, and I can suspend you without pay, pending its outcome effective immediately, and I can tell you as the person who will be running that review exactly how it's going to go." He tucked the file under his arm. "You're done at Whitmore Global, Nathan. Not because you insulted a rich man tonight. That's not why. You're done because of Rosa and David and Terrence and 20 others who were too afraid to speak until now. The rich man is just the reason they finally get to." The room was utterly silent, and Nathan Whitmore in that silence finally understood that there was no charm, no argument, no relationship, no amount of talking that was going to save him, because the thing that had destroyed him was not one bad decision at a wedding. It was who he had been for years. It was every small cruelty he thought no one was counting. And people had been counting the whole time. He looked at Emily one last time. "Emily," he said, and his voice cracked, and for one moment there was something almost human in it, something almost like the boy he might have been before the ambition ate him alive. "Emily, please, I'll change. I swear to God I'll change. Just give me one more chance." And it was Michael who answered him gently, almost kindly. "Nathan," Michael said, "a man who changes only after he loses everything hasn't learned a lesson. He's only learned about consequences. And I'm sorry, son, I truly am. because somewhere underneath all of this, there was probably a scared young man who just wanted to matter, and the world never taught him that he already did. Michael shook his head. But my daughter is not a chance for you to practice becoming a better man. She is not your redemption, and I will not let you use her to become one. Nathan opened his mouth, and then he closed it, because there was nothing left to say. He turned, and in front of the 300 guests he had spent his whole life trying to impress, in front of the investors and the board members and the old money Nathan Whitmore, walked out of his own wedding alone, the same way he had made Michael walk out of it 2 hours before, except that no one escorted him because no one needed to, because there was no one left in that room who was on his side. The great doors closed behind him, and for a moment no one moved. Then Harold Bishop, the old man, who had predicted all of it, began slowly to clap, and another guest joined him, and another. And within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, 300 of the wealthiest people in Connecticut, giving a standing ovation, not to the money, not to the reveal, but to the man in the worn navy suit who had walked back through those doors with his dignity fully intact, and to the daughter who had chosen her father over a life of comfort, without a single second of hesitation. Michael did not want the applause. He raised a hand gently and it quieted. "Please," he said, "please don't. I didn't come here to be applauded. I came here to walk my daughter down an aisle, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen today." A soft, sad laugh moved through the crowd. "But I'll tell you what I did come here to learn. I came to learn whether the man my daughter loved could see the worth of a person who had nothing to offer him. And I have my answer. And so does she. And as painful as today has been, I would rather my Emily find out who Nathan was on this day in this room than 1 year or 5 years or 20 years from now in a quiet house when it was far too late to walk away." He looked at his daughter, and Emily looked back at him in her ruined wedding day and her beautiful dress, and she was not crying anymore. She was smiling, a small, real exhausted smile. "Come on, sweetheart," Michael said, holding out his arm. "Let me take you home." Emily took her father's arm, but before they could take a single step, a voice stopped them. Diane, Emily's mother, who had been standing quietly through all of it, watching the man she had married for 32 years, reveal himself once again to a room full of strangers as exactly the man she had always known him to be. "Michael," Diane said, and her voice was thick, "you waited 2 years to tell that boy who you were. 2 years, watching him treat people like dirt. Why did you let it go on so long?" And Michael looked at his wife, and then he looked at his daughter, and then he looked for a long moment at the small brown paper package still held in his weathered hand, the one that held a letter and a broken pocket watch, and he answered her. "Because I hoped I was wrong," Michael said simply. "Diane, I have been right about a great many men in my life. I built an empire by being right about men, and every single time I was right about a man being cruel or greedy or cold, it cost me nothing. It made me money. But this time being right cost me my daughter's happiness. And so God forgive me, I stretched it out. I gave him chance after chance after chance, not because I thought he deserved them, but because every chance I gave him was one more day I got to hope that our girl had chosen well. I was not protecting Nathan, Diane." His voice broke just slightly for the first time all day. "I was protecting the dream that my daughter was going to be happy, and I held on to that dream long past the point I should have. That's my failure in all this. Not his. Mine." Emily's arms went around her father's neck. "It wasn't your failure, Daddy," she whispered. "You gave me the one thing that saved me. You gave me your eyes. It just took me a while to learn how to use them." And Michael Carter closed his eyes and held his daughter in the middle of the wreckage of her wedding. And for the first time all day, one single tear escaped and rolled down into his daughter's hair. And it was not a tear of anger, and it was not a tear of triumph. It was a tear of relief, because his little girl was safe. The guests began slowly to gather their things and file out quietly, respectfully, many of them stopping to shake Michael's hand on the way this time, not because of what he owned, but because of what they had watched him do. And Michael shook every single one of their hands with the same warmth, the same attention, whether they were the richest investor in the room or the young man who had come to refill the water glasses, because that was who Michael Carter was, and that was who he had always been, whether anyone was watching or not. And as the ballroom slowly emptied, Reginald Simmons came and stood quietly beside his old friend. "You did the right thing, Michael," he said softly. "Did I?" Michael watched his daughter, who had gone to comfort her weeping mother. "I don't know, Reggie. I feel like I just detonated a bomb in the middle of my little girl's wedding day." "You didn't detonate it," Reginald said. "He built it, brick by brick for years, out of every cruel thing he ever did to somebody smaller than him. You just happened to be standing there when it went off." He put a hand on Michael's shoulder. "And you shielded her from the worst of it. She'll grieve, but she'll grieve a wedding that didn't happen, not a marriage that destroyed her. That's a mercy, old friend, even if it doesn't feel like one tonight." Michael nodded slowly. And then he did something that made Reginald raise an eyebrow. He reached into the brown paper package and he took out the old pocket watch, the one that had been broken when Nathan hurled it across the marble floor that morning. The crystal face was cracked. The hands had stopped. And Michael looked at it at the 3 words engraved on the back character over comfort, and a strange, thoughtful expression crossed his face. "Reggie," Michael said, "Monday morning before the review, I want you to do something for me. Anything. That intern, David, the one who quit and moved back to Ohio. What about him?" "Find him," Michael said. "Find all of them. Rosa, Terrence, every name in that folder. The ones Nathan stepped on because he thought they'd never matter." Michael closed his hand around the broken watch. "I want to know their names, not as complaints in a file, as people. Because a company that only makes room for the Nathans of the world isn't a company I want my name on. And I think it's time this old man came out of the shadows and built something that would have made my father proud." Reginald Simmons looked at his friend for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled. "Your father," Reginald said, "the bricklayer." "The bricklayer," Michael agreed, "who never owned a suit as nice as this cheap one, and who is worth more than every soul in this room, including me." He slipped the broken watch back into his pocket against his heart. "It's time, Reggie. Not for revenge. I've never had the stomach for revenge, and it's too late in life to develop one now, but for something better. For the thing I should have been doing all along instead of hiding." And across the emptying ballroom, Emily Carter looked up from her mother's shoulder and found her father's eyes, and she saw the look on his face, a look she had not seen since she was a little girl. A look of a man who has just decided to do something enormous. And she felt for the first time since the awful text had arrived upstairs that maybe, just maybe, out of the wreckage of this impossible day, something good was about to be built. She had no idea how right she was. The drive home that night was the quietest either of them had ever known. Emily sat in the passenger seat of her father's old car, the same car Nathan had mocked so many times, still in her wedding dress, because she had refused to change out of it. Refused to give the day even that small surrender. She stared out the window at the dark highway, and Michael drove with both hands on the wheel the way he always had, and for a long time neither of them said a word. Then, somewhere around the 2nd hour, Emily spoke. "Dad," she said, "how long?" "How long what, sweetheart? How long did you know about what kind of man he was?" Michael was quiet for a moment. He never lied to his daughter. He had built his entire fatherhood on that one principle, and he was not going to abandon it now, not tonight of all nights. "I had a feeling the first time I met him," Michael admitted. "There's a certain way a man shakes your hand when he's already decided you don't matter. Nathan shook my hand that way. But a feeling isn't proof, Emily. And I have watched too many fathers destroy their relationship with a daughter by declaring war on the man she loves before he's earned it. So I waited. I watched. And I hoped I was wrong. But you weren't." "No," Michael said softly. "I wasn't." Emily turned to look at him. "The complaints Reginald read, Rosa and the intern and the man in the parking garage, you knew about all of those for months." "I did. And you still let me get engaged to him." Michael's hands tightened on the wheel, and he was silent long enough that Emily thought maybe she had hurt him, and part of her, the angry, grieving part, wanted to have hurt him because she needed somewhere to put all the pain that had nowhere else to go. "Yes," Michael finally said. "I did, and I have been asking myself that same question for the last 4 hours. Emily and I'll be asking it for the rest of my life. Should I have shown you the file? Should I have sat you down a year ago and said, Sweetheart, the man you love is cruel to people who can't fight back here, is the proof. Please don't marry him. He shook his head slowly. I've watched it 100 times, Emily. A father hands his daughter proof that the man she loves is no good, and do you know what happens? 9 times out of 10, she marries him anyway. Out of spite, out of loyalty, out of the certainty that her father just doesn't understand him the way she does. And then the father spends the next 20 years on the outside of her life because he made her choose and she chose wrong. Emily said nothing, because she knew deep down that he was right. She knew exactly what she would have done a year ago if her father had handed her that file. She would have told him he was jealous or controlling or that he didn't want her to be happy. She would have run straight into Nathan's arms. So I made a different choice, Michael continued. A harder one. I decided that the only person who could ever show you who Nathan really was Nathan. Not me. Not a file. Him. And I trusted Emily. I trusted that when the moment came when he finally revealed himself, you would be strong enough and clear enough to see it. And you were. He glanced over at her, and even in the dark, she could see that his eyes were wet. You were sweetheart. You saw it in 5 minutes. You took off that ring in front of 300 people without me saying a single word to you. That was all you. And that's how I know I raised you right, even if I couldn't protect you from the hurt of it. Emily's throat closed up. She reached across the seat and put her hand over her father's on the gear shift, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they drove the rest of the way home like that hand in hand in the old car in the dark. That was Saturday night. By Monday morning, the story had already begun to spread. It started as these things do now with the guests. 300 of the most connected people in Connecticut had witnessed the most dramatic wedding collapse any of them had ever seen, and not one of them could keep it to themselves. By Sunday afternoon, it was the only thing anyone in certain circles was talking about. The groom who threw the bride's father out for looking too poor. The father who turned out to own the company. The bride who took off her ring in front of everyone. It had everything. It spread from dinner party to dinner party, from phone call to phone call, and then inevitably it jumped to the internet where a guest's cousin who worked in media wrote it up without names at first as a story, too good to be true. But the names came out. They always do. By Monday afternoon, Nathan Whitmore's name was attached to the story everywhere. And Nathan Whitmore, who had spent his entire adult life building an image, watched that image incinerate in real time, refresh by refresh, comment by comment, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Reginald Simmons walked into the executive floor of Whitmore Global Holdings at 7 o'clock Monday morning, an hour before anyone else arrived carrying the file. He had not slept much. He had spent most of Sunday on the phone with the company's head of human resources and its general counsel, and he had spent the rest of it doing something he had promised Michael he would do. He had started finding the names. At 8:15, Nathan arrived. He should not have come in. Any sensible man in his position would have stayed home, would have called a lawyer, would have waited for the storm to pass. But Nathan Whitmore had never in his life been able to accept that a fight was already lost. He came in wearing his sharpest suit, his jaw set, his eyes hard, because in his mind there was still a version of this where he walked into Reginald's office and made his case executive to executive and salvaged something from the wreckage. He was wrong. Reginald was waiting for him. So was Patricia Vance, the head of human resources, a woman Nathan had never once bothered to be kind to, because he had decided long ago that HR was beneath his concern. And so was a third person Nathan did not recognize, a quiet man in a gray suit with a leather folder who turned out to be from the company's outside counsel. "Sit down, Nathan," Reginald said. "I'd rather stand," Nathan said. "Reginald, I think we both know that what happened this weekend was a personal matter that has nothing to do with—" "Sit down," Reginald said again, and this time there was no warmth in it at all, and Nathan sat. What followed was not a negotiation. Nathan understood that within the first 60 seconds. Patricia Vance opened a folder identical to the one Reginald had held at the wedding, and she began in a calm and clinical voice to walk through it. Not the wedding. The wedding was never even mentioned. She walked through 4 years of documented incidents, name by name, date by date, witness by witness. By date, On March 4th of last year, Patricia said, you told a junior analyst named Priya Sharma in front of 4 colleagues that she was, quote, too slow to be worth the salary we're wasting on her, unquote. Ms. Sharma requested a transfer to a different department the following week. She cited in her transfer request a hostile work environment. That's absurd. I was giving her feedback. On June 19th, Patricia continued as if he had not spoken. You screamed at a facilities employee named Terrence Boyd in the parking structure for approximately 3 minutes because you had parked in a reserved space that was not yours and he asked you to move. 3 witnesses filed statements. One of them was a vice president. Nathan's mouth went dry. On September 2nd, you made an intern named David Okafor cry in a conference room on his 4th day of employment over a formatting error in a document. Mr. Okafor resigned 11 days later. He left the finance industry entirely. In his exit interview, which was documented, he said, and I'm quoting him directly, I've never in my life been made to feel so worthless by another human being. He was incompetent, Nathan said, but his voice had lost its force and everyone in the room could hear it. He was 22, Patricia said quietly, and he was, according to his supervisor's notes, one of the most promising interns the department had seen in years. He just made one small mistake in front of the wrong man on the wrong day. Reginald leaned forward. Do you want me to go on, Nathan? Because there are 19 more. 19 more names. 19 more people you decided didn't matter because they couldn't do anything for your career, and you were wrong every single time because they mattered to me and they mattered to this company and they mattered to the man whose name is on the building. Nathan sat very still. You're firing me, he said. No, Reginald said. That's the part I want you to understand, Nathan, because I think it's the only thing that might someday, if you're lucky, actually teach you something. We are not firing you. We are terminating your employment for cause, following a documented review of 23 separate substantiated complaints of workplace misconduct spanning 4 years. There is a difference. Being fired is something that happens to you. This is something you did, over years, to people who trusted this company to protect them from exactly this. The man from outside counsel slid a document across the table. This outlines the terms of your separation, he said. I'd advise you to have your own attorney review it before signing anything. But I'll tell you now, Mr. Whitmore, the terms are firm. There is no severance, there is no reference, and there is a non-disparagement clause that goes both directions, which, given the circumstances, is considerably more in your interest than in ours. Nathan stared at the document. And then, because he was Nathan, because he had never once in his life gone down without reaching for the cruelest weapon he could find, he looked up at Reginald and he said, This is about the old man. This is Carter using the company to settle a personal grudge because I embarrassed him at a party. You can dress it up in HR language all you want, Reginald. But we both know that if I hadn't thrown Michael Carter out of that wedding, none of this would be happening. Those complaints would still be sitting in a drawer where they've been for years. You're not firing me for what I did. You're firing me because of who I did it to. And for a moment the room was silent, because there was buried in that ugly accusation one small splinter of truth, and Nathan knew it, and he watched Reginald's face to see if it had landed. It had not. You're half right, Reginald said, and I'm going to give you the courtesy of a completely honest answer because it's the last one you'll ever get from me. Yes, Nathan. Those complaints sat in a file for years, and that was wrong. That was a failure. This company's failure, my failure, that we let a man like you keep hurting people because you were good at the parts of the job that made us money. You're right about that. It should never have taken you attacking the chairman to force our hand. He stood up. But here's the part you'll never understand, because understanding it would require you to be a different man than you are. The reason Michael Carter threw that wedding is not the reason you're being fired. The wedding just told him what the file had been telling me for years, and what I couldn't make him act on until he saw it with his own eyes. You didn't get caught because you insulted a rich man. You got caught because a rich man finally saw up close what you'd been doing to poor ones the whole time. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. Neither could I. Neither can any of us anymore. Reginald buttoned his jacket. So take your grudge theory, Nathan. Hold on to it. Tell yourself this was all just a powerful man's revenge. Because the alternative that you did this to yourself one cruelty at a time to 23 people who never did anything to you, that's a truth I don't think you're strong enough to carry. Nathan had no answer. He signed nothing that day. He took the document and he walked out of the building where he had worked for 6 years, and this time there was no crowd to walk out on, just a security guard at the front desk, an older man named Walt, whom Nathan had passed 10,000 times over the years and never once greeted by name. And as Nathan walked past him for the last time, carrying a cardboard box of his belongings, Walt looked up and something almost like pity crossed the old man's face, and he said quietly, "Take care of yourself, son." And Nathan Whitmore, who had spent his whole life clawing toward a place where men like Walt would have to respect him, stopped dead in the lobby, because the security guard he had ignored for 6 years had just shown him more genuine kindness in 4 words than Nathan had shown anyone in that entire building the whole time he'd worked there. And Nathan opened his mouth to say something, and nothing came out, and he walked out the door into a life that was suddenly completely empty. Meanwhile, 30 miles away, Michael Carter was keeping the promise he had made in the ruins of his daughter's wedding. He had told Reginald to find the names, and Reginald had found them. And now on Tuesday morning, Michael Carter did something that the executives of Whitmore Global Holdings had not seen him do in over a decade. He came to the office. He did not come in through the executive entrance. He did not announce himself. He walked in through the main lobby wearing the same kind of simple, modest clothes he always wore, and the security guard at the desk, Walt, did not recognize him and asked him politely if he had an appointment. "I do," Michael said, "but you won't find it in your book. I'm here to see some people who work in this building. Rosa in the 3rd floor break room, Terrence in facilities, a few others." He smiled at Walt. "And I'd very much like to know your name if you'd be willing to tell it to me." "It's Walt, sir," the guard said, a little confused. "Walt Henderson." "Walt Henderson," Michael repeated, committing it to memory the way he committed every name to memory. "How long have you worked here, Walt?" 22 years, sir." 22 years. Michael nodded slowly. "That's longer than almost anyone in this whole building, isn't it? Longer than most of the executives. Longer than the man who just left carrying a box, I'd wager." Walt's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know about that?" "I know about a lot of things, Walt," Michael said gently. "I'm going to tell you something now, and I'd be grateful if you didn't spread it around just yet, because I've got a few conversations to have first. My name is Michael Carter. I founded this company 30 years ago, and I'm ashamed to say that in all those years I never once made sure that a man who'd given us 22 years of his life was being treated the way he deserved. That's going to change, starting today, starting with you." Walt Henderson stared at the modestly dressed old man in front of him, and his mouth fell open, and Michael simply patted him kindly on the shoulder and walked toward the elevator, leaving the security guard standing there in absolute astonishment. What happened over the next several hours became, in its own quiet way, as legendary within Whitmore Global as the wedding had become outside of it. Michael Carter, the chairman of the board, the founder of the company, a man worth more than most of the people in that building would earn in 100 lifetimes, spent the entire day walking the floors, and he did not visit a single executive. He went to the 3rd floor break room, and he found Rosa Mendez refilling the coffee station, and he introduced himself not as the chairman, but as a man who had heard about how she'd been treated and wanted to apologize on behalf of the whole company. Rosa did not believe him at first. She thought it was a joke or a test or some kind of trap. But Michael sat with her at one of the little break room tables, and he asked her about her life, about her kids, about how long she'd worked there. And he listened, really listened, the way he listened to taxi drivers and waiters and everyone else the world had taught to expect to be ignored. And by the end of the conversation, Rosa Mendez was crying, and Michael was holding her hand across the table, and he was telling her that a man named Nathan Whitmore had been wrong about her, completely and totally wrong, and that she had never once been stupid, and that this company was lucky to have her. He found Terrence Boyd in the parking structure, and he apologized for the 3 minutes of screaming Terrence had endured in that exact spot, and he asked Terrence to walk him through his job, and he listened to a man talk about parking logistics for 20 minutes, like it was the most fascinating subject in the world, because to Terrence it was his work, and his work had dignity, and Michael understood that better than anyone. He could not find David Okafor, the intern, who had moved back to Ohio because David had left the company months ago. But Reginald had tracked him down, and by Tuesday evening, Michael Carter personally placed a phone call to a young man in Ohio who had given up on finance entirely because one cruel man had convinced him he was worthless. "David Okafor," Michael said when the young man picked up. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Michael Carter. I'm the founder of Whitmore Global Holdings, and I'm calling to tell you that a man named Nathan Whitmore made a terrible mistake about you. He was fired yesterday. And before I let another day go by, I wanted to hear from your own supervisor's notes, which I have in front of me right now, that you were one of the most promising young people that department had seen in years. So I have to ask you, David, are you happy in Ohio? Or would you consider coming back to a company that would be very, very glad to have you?" There was a long silence on the line, and then David Okafor, 22 years old, who had cried in a conference room and quit an entire career because a cruel man had broken something in him, began very quietly to cry again, but not the same way. "Sir," David finally managed, I don't understand. Why would you? I was just an intern. I made a mistake. You made a formatting error, son," Michael said gently, "on your 4th day. And a grown man who should have known better made you feel like your whole life was a formatting error. That's not on you, David. That was never on you. And I'd like the chance to prove that to you if you'll let me." By the end of that week, the story had transformed into something bigger than a wedding. It had become quietly at first, and then all at once the story of what Michael Carter did after the wedding. It got out the way these things get out, that the reclusive founder had come out of the shadows and spent a full day apologizing to the people his former executive had abused, that he had personally called a fired intern in Ohio and offered him his job back at a promotion, no less. That he had learned the name of a security guard who had worked there for 22 years and had that same afternoon instructed HR to review the compensation and title of every long-tenured facilities and support staff member in the entire company. And people, ordinary people, the kind of people who had spent their own lives being treated like Rosa and Terrence and David, began to share the story for a completely different reason than the wedding drama that had started it. They shared it because it gave them something they almost never got. Hope. Hope that somewhere out there were still powerful people who understood that a person's worth had nothing to do with their job title or their paycheck. Emily saw it happen. She was staying at her parents' modest house that week, recovering, and she watched her father, who had spent 30 years hiding, suddenly step into the light, not for himself, never for himself, but for a break room worker and a parking attendant and a boy in Ohio. And something began to heal in her watching him, because she realized that the values her father had spent her whole childhood trying to teach her, the values she had almost thrown away for a man like Nathan, were not just words. They were the way her father actually lived when it cost him something, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain. "Dad," she said one evening, as they sat on the porch of the little house Nathan had always been ashamed of, "can I ask you something?" "Always. All those years, all that money, and you lived here in this house, drove that car, ate at that same diner. Mom told me once you could have bought a mansion in Greenwich 10 times over. Why didn't you? Why like this?" Michael was quiet for a while, looking out at the small yard, the old oak tree, the ordinary street. "When I was a boy," he finally said, "my father laid bricks for a living. Good man, hardest working man I ever knew, and every Friday he'd come home covered in dust, and he'd empty his pockets on the kitchen table, and there was never quite enough. And I watched the way the world treated him, Emily. I watched people look right through him. I watched them talk down to him. I watched a man, once a wealthy man, a man in a nice suit, snap his fingers at my father like he was a dog to get him to move a wheelbarrow out of the way." Michael's jaw tightened at a memory 40 years old. "And I decided something standing there as a boy. I decided that if I ever made something of myself, I would never ever become the man in the nice suit. And the only way I could be sure of that, the only way I could really know, was to make sure that no one ever knew what I had. Because the moment they know what you have, Emily, they stop showing you who they are." Emily leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "You built a whole empire," she said softly, "just so you could keep being your father's son." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, I suppose I did. And the two of them sat on that porch as the sun went down in the modest house that a man like Nathan Whitmore would have been ashamed of, the house that was in truth worth more than every mansion in Greenwich because of the man who lived in it and the life he had chosen and the daughter he had raised, who had almost lost her way and had found it again on the worst and most important day of her life. But there was one conversation still left to have. Because on Thursday of that week, Diane Carter came to Michael in his small study, where he was reading through Reginald's reports on the compensation review, and she sat down across from him, and she had a strange look on her face. "Michael," she said, "Nathan's mother called me today." Michael set down his papers. "Vivian." "Vivian?" Diane folded her hands in her lap. She wanted to talk. And Michael, I almost hung up on her. I almost said everything I've wanted to say to that woman for 2 years. But I didn't. I listened. And I think you need to hear what she told me. "I'm listening." Diane took a breath. "Nathan wasn't born into money," she said. "You know that. But I don't think you know the whole of it. Vivian raised him alone on nothing in a part of town nobody wants to talk about. His father left when he was 4. And Vivian told me, Michael, that when Nathan was a boy, other children used to torment him for his clothes, for his shoes, for the fact that he came to school with holes in his coat in the winter. She said there was one year when he was maybe 10 that a group of wealthy boys made his life such a misery that he stopped speaking for almost 2 months, just went silent from the shame of it." Michael was very still. "And Vivian said," Diane continued, and her voice had gone soft, "that from that year on, Nathan swore he would never be poor again, never be looked down on again, never be the boy with holes in his coat again. And he spent his whole life running from that boy so hard and so fast that somewhere along the way, he turned into the very kind of person who used to torment him. He became the wealthy boy sneering at the poor one, except now he was on the other side of it." Diane's eyes were wet. "Vivian said she watched it happen and she didn't know how to stop it. And she called me today, Michael, not to ask us to take him back, she knows that's over, but to tell me that she is sorry for all of it. And to tell me that the person Nathan humiliated at that wedding was the exact person Nathan used to be. A person in a cheap coat that everyone assumed had nothing." The study was silent for a long moment. And Michael Carter, who had every reason in the world to feel nothing but contempt for Nathan Whitmore, closed his eyes, and something moved across his weathered face that was not anger, and was not triumph, and was not even the disappointment he had carried all week. It was something far more complicated. It was grief. Grief for a 10-year-old boy who had gone silent from shame, and who had grown into a man so terrified of that boy that he spent his whole life becoming the thing he hated. "That poor child," Michael said quietly. Diane looked up in surprise. "You feel sorry for him?" "I feel sorry for the boy he was," Michael said. "I don't excuse the man he became. A hard childhood explains a man, Diane. It doesn't absolve him. Plenty of people grow up with holes in their coats and turn into the kindest souls you'll ever meet. Your husband, for one." He allowed himself a small, sad smile. "But yes, I feel sorry for that boy, because somewhere back there, someone taught him the same lie the whole world tries to teach all of us, that your worth is your wealth, and he believed it so completely that he built his entire life on it. And when a man builds his whole self on a lie, Diane, and the lie finally cracks, there's nothing underneath to catch him. That's what I watched happen at that wedding. I didn't just watch a cruel man get what he deserved. I watched a frightened boy finally fall through the floor he'd been standing on his whole life." Diane reached across the desk and took her husband's hand. "You're a better man than he deserved as an enemy," she said. "No," Michael said. "I'm just a man who got lucky enough to be raised by a bricklayer who knew what mattered." He squeezed her hand. "Nathan never got that, and that's the real tragedy of him. Not that he lost his job, or his reputation, or our daughter. The real tragedy is that he had everything he needed to be a good man, and he threw it all away chasing the one thing that was never going to fill the hole. And by the time he figures that out, if he ever does, it's going to be far too late to fix what he broke." And as it turned out, Michael was right about that too. Because at that very moment across town, Nathan Whitmore was sitting alone in his apartment, staring at his phone at a screen full of his own name attached to the worst day of his life. and he was learning one refresh at a time exactly how much a reputation is worth once it's gone, and exactly how few of the powerful friends he'd spent his life collecting would return his calls now that he had nothing left to offer them. And in the silence of that empty apartment for the first time since he was 10 years old, Nathan Whitmore was beginning very slowly and very painfully to understand something about himself that he had spent his entire life running from. But whether that understanding would save him or destroy him completely was a question that not even Michael Carter could answer yet. The question of whether Nathan would be saved or destroyed did not stay a question for long. 3 weeks after this wedding, on a gray Tuesday morning, Nathan Whitmore did something he had sworn to himself he would never do. He drove to the modest house in the ordinary neighborhood, the house he had mocked 100 times, the house he had been ashamed of. And he parked his expensive car at the curb, and he sat in it for almost 40 minutes before he found the courage to get out. He had lost weight. The sharp suit hung loose on him now. He had not shaved in days, and in his hands he held something that would have been unthinkable to the Nathan of a month ago. A cheap bouquet of flowers, the kind you buy at a gas station, and a letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. He walked up the path to the door, and he knocked. Michael Carter answered. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. The founder of an empire in his simple clothes, and the fallen executive in his expensive suit that no longer fit, and the distance between who each of them appeared to be and who each of them actually was, had never been wider. "Nathan," Michael said. He did not sound surprised. He did not sound angry. He sounded more than anything tired. "Mr. Carter." Nathan's voice cracked on the words. "I know I have no right to be here. I know that. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me because I don't think a person can be forgiven for what I did. I needed to say some things to you and to Emily in person, and then I'll leave and I'll never come back. I swear it, please. Just 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Michael studied him for a long moment, and then to Nathan's complete astonishment, he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, Nathan," Michael said. "You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in a week. Diane made too much soup. Sit down." Nathan stood frozen on the doorstep. Of all the reactions he had imagined, being invited in for soup had not been one of them. "Sir, I don't deserve." "No," Michael agreed. "You don't. But my father used to say that if we only fed the people who deserved it, half the world would starve, and the wrong half at that. Come in, before the neighbors start wondering why there's a man crying on my porch." Nathan came in. Emily was in the kitchen. She turned when she heard the door, and when she saw who it was, her whole body went rigid, and the color drained from her face, and for a moment Michael thought she might bolt from the room. But she didn't. She planted her feet, and she lifted her chin, and she looked at the man she had almost married, and she said in a voice that was remarkably steady, "What are you doing here, Nathan?" "Emily." He took a step toward her and then stopped himself because he saw her flinch, and he understood that he had lost the right to approach her. "I came to say I'm sorry. And I know how empty that sounds. I know sorry doesn't fix anything. But I've spent 3 weeks with nothing but my own thoughts, and I've realized some things, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to say them to your face." "Then say them," Emily said. And Nathan Whitmore, in the modest kitchen of the house he had been ashamed of standing in front of the woman he had lost, and the man who had destroyed him, began to talk. "When I was 10 years old, he said, I stopped speaking for 2 months. Emily's eyes flickered with recognition, and Nathan saw it and understood. "Your mother told you," he said quietly, "about my childhood." "My mother told my mother," Emily said. "Yes, I know about the coat with the holes. I know about the boys who tormented you. I know all of it, Nathan." "Then you know more than I ever told you in 2 years, Nathan said, and there was shame in it, because I never told you. In 2 years of being with you, I never once let you see that boy. I was so terrified of him, Emily. I was so terrified that if you saw where I really came from, you'd look at me the way those boys looked at me. So I built this other version of myself, the successful one, the one with the suits and the title and the important friends. And I thought if I could just become that man completely enough, the boy with the holes in his coat would disappear forever." He looked down at his hands. "And then your father walked into our wedding," he said, and his voice broke. In a cheap suit, carrying a paper package, looking exactly like a person the world had decided didn't matter. And Emily, God help me, I didn't see your father. I saw that boy. I saw the 10-year-old me that I've been running from my whole life. And I hated him. I hated him so much that I had him thrown into the street. A tear slid down Nathan's face. I didn't throw your father out because he looked poor. I threw him out because he looked like me. The real me. The me I've spent 30 years trying to kill. And the cruelest thing, the thing I can't stop thinking about, is that your father, the man I treated like garbage because he reminded me of the poor boy I used to be, that man grew up exactly like me. Poor, looked down on, holes in his coat probably, and he became the kindest, most decent man in that entire room, and I became the man snapping his fingers at the help. The kitchen was completely silent. Michael, standing by the counter, had gone very still, because Nathan had, without knowing it, described the exact scene from Michael's own childhood, the wealthy man snapping his fingers at his bricklayer father, and Michael felt something turn over in his chest, something he had not expected to feel for this young man. You want to know the worst part? Nathan continued, wiping his face with the back of his hand. The worst part isn't losing my job. It isn't losing my reputation or my friends or watching my name become a punchline all over the internet. The worst part is that I lost you, Emily, and I didn't lose you because your father owned a company. I lost you 3 weeks before I even knew that the moment I called security. I lost you the second I showed you who I really was. And the thing that keeps me up at night is knowing that the man I became, the successful man, the impressive man, the man I built to make you love me, is the exact man who made you stop. Emily's eyes were wet now, but she did not go to him. She stood her ground. Nathan, she said, and her voice was gentler than it had been, but no less firm. I believe you. I believe that you understand now what you did, and I believe that the boy you were deserved so much better than the world gave him. I do. And I'm sorry, so sorry that anyone ever made a child feel that worthless. She took a breath. But understanding why you did something isn't the same as it being okay that you did it. My father didn't have to lose his kindness to survive his childhood. Rosa didn't. Terrence didn't. That intern David, the one you broke, he didn't turn around and go break someone smaller than him. You did. You had a choice every single day, and you chose to become the thing that hurt you. And I can feel sorry for the boy and still not want to spend my life with the man he chose to become. Nathan closed his eyes, and he nodded slowly because he had known coming here that this was the answer he would get. And he had come anyway because some things a person has to say out loud, even when they know it won't change anything. I know, he whispered. I know. I didn't come here to win you back, Emily. I came here because you deserve to hear the truth from me at least once. You deserve to know that it was never about the money, and that the man who hurt you knows now exactly what he threw away, and that he's going to spend the rest of his life trying to become someone who would never do it again. Not to get you back. I know that's over. But because you were right about me, and your father was right about me, and I'd rather spend the rest of my life proving you right about who I could become than proving you right about who I was. And then Nathan turned to Michael, and he did the thing he had come more than anything to do. He held out the cheap gas station flowers and the letter. Mr. Carter, he said, I can't give you back your daughter's wedding day. I can't undo what I did to you in front of all those people, but I wrote you a letter. It's not an excuse, it's an apology, and it's a promise. And these flowers, I know they're cheap. I know they're nothing. I bought them at a gas station on the way here. He let out a broken laugh. And I stood in that gas station for 20 minutes holding these $5 flowers, feeling ashamed, thinking about how you must have felt every day of your life, carrying that cheap package into rooms full of people who judged you for it. And I realized I'd never once in my life given anyone a gift that cost me something real. So these flowers are cheap, sir, but they're the first honest thing I've given anyone in a very long time. Michael Carter looked at the gas station flowers, and he looked at the letter, and he looked at the young man holding them, this broken, humbled, weeping young man who had finally, at the cost of everything, begun to see himself clearly. And Michael took the flowers. Sit down, Nathan, he said quietly. Have some soup. And then I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen to every word of it, because it may be the most important thing anyone ever says to you. Nathan sat. Emily got a bowl. She did not smile at Nathan, and she did not soften toward him, but she got him a bowl of soup and set it in front of him, and that small act of grace from the woman he had wronged most of all nearly broke Nathan completely. And Michael sat down across from him, and he folded his hands, and he began. "When I was a boy," Michael said, "I watched a rich man snap his fingers at my father to make him move a wheelbarrow. Snapped his fingers, like my father was a dog." Nathan's head came up sharply, because it was the same image he had used unknowingly minutes before. And I made a decision standing there that I would never become that man. And you know what, Nathan, I kept that promise. 30 years in Empire, more money than a person could ever need, and I kept that promise. But I want to tell you the truth about how I kept it because I think you need to hear it. Michael leaned forward. I didn't keep it by becoming a saint. I kept it by never forgetting the boy I was. Every single day of my life, I have looked at every waiter, every driver, every janitor, every person the world overlooks, and I have seen my father in them, and I have seen myself. That memory, that boy, the one you spent your whole life running from Nathan, is the exact thing that could have saved you. He wasn't your weakness, he was your compass, and you threw him away. Nathan was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. But here is what I need you to understand, Michael continued, and his voice softened. It is not too late to pick him back up. Nathan looked up. Your 32-year-old son, Michael said. You have half your life ahead of you, and you've just been handed the single most valuable thing a man can ever receive. You've been handed the truth about yourself while you're still young enough to do something about it. Most cruel men never get that. Most cruel men die cruel, surrounded by people who fear them and no one who loves them, and they never once understand why. But you, Nathan, you understand. 3 weeks of hell, and you understand more about yourself than most men learn in a lifetime. That's not a curse. That's a gift, a terrible, painful gift. And what you do with it now is the only thing that's ever going to matter. I don't know how, Nathan whispered. I don't know how to be him, the other one, the good one. I don't even know if he exists. He exists, Michael said. He's 10 years old and he's sitting in a corner not speaking because the world was cruel to him. And he's been waiting 30 years for you to come back for him. And here's how you start, Nathan. You don't start by becoming impressive. God knows you tried that and look where it got you. You start small. You start by learning the name of the next person who serves you coffee. You start by thanking the man who parks your car. You start by finding the David Okafors of the world, the young people you can lift up instead of crush, and you lift them up one at a time expecting nothing back, because that, Nathan, that is the only thing that has ever in the history of the world filled the hole that you've been trying to fill with money and titles your entire life. Nathan sat there, the soup going cold in front of him, and he wept and he nodded. And Michael Carter, the man he had thrown into the street, reached across the table and put his weathered hand on the young man's shoulder and gave him the one thing Nathan had never received from anyone in his entire life, not from the boys who tormented him, not from the executives he'd charmed, not from the friends who had abandoned him the moment he had nothing to offer. Michael gave him a chance to become a better man, not a chance to get anything back. Not Emily, not the job, not the reputation. Those were gone, but a chance freely given, expecting nothing in return to become someone worth being. And that, more than anything else that had happened in that whole terrible month, was the thing that finally cracked Nathan Whitmore all the way open, because for the first time in his life, someone had given him something valuable for absolutely nothing at a moment when he had absolutely nothing to give in return. And he finally understood in his bones what his whole life had been missing. Nathan left an hour later. He did not ask for anything. He did not try to hug Emily or shake Michael's hand or extend the visit past the moment it was meant to end. He simply thanked them quietly, and he walked back to his expensive car in his ill-fitting suit, and he drove away, and Michael and Emily watched him go from the porch. "Do you think he'll actually change?" Emily asked. Michael was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Most people don't, Emily. Most people who hit the bottom claw their way back up and become exactly who they were before, because the lesson fades the second the pain does. That's the truth of it. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise." He put his arm around his daughter. "But every once in a while, once in a great while, A person hits the bottom hard enough and clearly enough that they actually see the thing that broke them. And when that happens, when a person really sees it, change becomes possible. Not guaranteed, never guaranteed, but possible. And Nathan saw it today. I watched him see it. Whether he holds on to it, that's up to him now. That's the one thing not even I can do for him. Emily leaned into her father. "You gave him a chance," she said, "after everything he did to you, to us. Why?" Michael looked out at the empty street where Nathan's car had disappeared. "Because someone gave me one once," he said quietly. "A long time ago, when I was young and angry and full of the poison the world had poured into me. I was on a road that could have taken me to exactly the place Nathan ended up, and an old man, a foreman on a construction site, saw it in me, and instead of firing me for my attitude, he sat me down and told me the truth about myself. And it saved my life, Emily. It's the whole reason there's a company with my name on it. It's the whole reason there's a you." He kissed the top of her head. "You don't pay a debt like that back to the person who gave it to you. They're usually long gone by the time you understand what they did. You pay it forward to the next angry, broken young person who reminds you of who you used to be, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it, because none of us deserve the second chances that save us. That's what makes them grace instead of wages." Emily was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I love you, Dad. I don't think I've ever understood until these last few weeks exactly who you are, but I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," Michael said. "More than every dollar I've ever made, which is saying quite a lot." Emily laughed a real laugh, the first real laugh since the wedding, and the two of them stood on the porch of the modest house as the gray afternoon softened toward evening. The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of healing. Emily went back to her own life, but she was different, and everyone around her could feel it. She had almost married a man who valued people by their usefulness, and she had walked away from him at the last possible second, and the experience had burned away something false in her and left something true and solid behind. She started spending her Saturdays volunteering at a shelter downtown, not out of guilt, and not to prove anything to anyone, but because she found that she liked being around people the world had overlooked the same way her father had always liked it, and she understood now that this was the inheritance that actually mattered, the one that had nothing to do with the company or the money. Michael, for his part, did not go back into the shadows. The wedding had pulled him into the light, and once there he decided that maybe it was time to stay. Not for the recognition. He still had no use for that. But he had seen in that one day walking the floors of his own company how many Rosas and Terrences and Davids there were, how many good people had spent years being overlooked by a system that only rewarded the Nathans, and he decided that a man with his resources and his years had no business hiding in a modest house when he could be doing something about it. He and Reginald began meeting weekly, and out of those meetings came something new. But before any of that could take shape, there was one more piece of the old story that had to be closed. Because about 6 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived at the modest house. It was addressed to Michael in an unfamiliar hand, and when Michael opened it, he found that it was from Vivian Whitmore, Nathan's mother, the woman who had looked at Michael's shoes on the steps of the mansion and asked if he was with the catering staff. Michael read the letter alone in his study, and when he finished it, he sat for a long time without moving. And then he called Diane in, and he handed it to her, and he watched his wife's face as she read it. It was an apology. But it was more than that. Vivian Whitmore, who had spent her whole life clawing her way up alongside her son, terrified of ever being poor again, had watched her boy's life collapse, and she had done something almost no one ever does. She had looked at her own reflection in the wreckage. She wrote that she was the one who had taught Nathan to fear poverty. She wrote that she had drilled into him from the time he was small that the only safety in this world was money, and the only way to matter was to have more than the people who had looked down on them. She wrote that she had watched her son turn into a hard, cold, grasping man, and that some part of her had been proud of it because she had mistaken his cruelty for strength and his coldness for success. and she wrote that it had taken watching him destroy himself and watching Michael Carter, the man she had insulted, respond with more grace than she had shown anyone in her entire life, for her to finally understand that she had raised her son to value all the wrong things, and that she had done it out of her own fear, and that the fear had been passed to her by her own hard life, the same way she had passed it to Nathan. "I looked at your shoes," she wrote near the end, "and I judged you the way I have judged people my whole life, the way I taught my son to judge people. And you turned out to be the most powerful man in the room. But that is not why I am ashamed. I am ashamed because even if you had been exactly what I assumed, you were a poor man with nothing, you would have deserved every bit of the kindness you did not receive from me or from my son. It took me 61 years and my child's ruin to understand something you have apparently understood your whole life. I do not expect your forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that your grace has not been wasted. It has reached one more person than you knew." Diane set the letter down with tears in her eyes. "My God, Michael," she said. "She actually understood it." "She did," Michael said softly. "After all these years, after a whole life of it." "It's never too late, Diane," Michael said. "That's the thing people forget. It's almost always later than it should be, but it's almost never too late." He took the letter back and looked at it, at the shaky handwriting of a proud woman who had finally humbled herself. "You know what this means, don't you? This means that when Nathan hit the bottom, he wasn't the only one who saw the truth. His mother saw it too. And a boy has a much better chance of actually changing when the person who shaped him is willing to change alongside him. This letter, Diane, this is the best news I've had since the wedding, because it means Nathan might not have to fight his way back alone." And Michael Carter did something then that surprised even his wife of 32 years. He picked up a pen and a piece of paper, and he began to write a reply to Vivian Whitmore. Not a cold one, not a distant one, a warm one from one person who had grown up poor to another, one parent to another, forgiving her fully and completely, and inviting her if she was willing to be part of whatever her son was going to try to build out of the ashes of his old life. Because that was who Michael Carter was. And as he wrote in his small study in his modest house, the last of the anger and the disappointment and the grief of that terrible wedding day finally drained out of him, and what was left in its place was the thing that had always been there underneath, the thing his bricklayer father had put there 60 years ago, and that no amount of wealth had ever changed. Grace. Simple, stubborn, unreasonable grace given freely to people who had not earned it, expecting nothing back, because that was the only thing Michael had ever found that actually made a life worth living. And he had a feeling as he signed his name at the bottom of that letter that the story which had started with such cruelty in that gilded ballroom was about to become a story about something else entirely, something that would reach far more people than the 300 who had watched him get thrown into the street. Something that would in the end matter far more than any of them could yet imagine. The thing Michael had a feeling about took exactly 4 months to take shape. It began as so much of this story had begun with a name in a file. But this time the file was not a list of complaints. It was a list of possibilities. Michael and Reginald had spent those 4 months week after week building something new, and on a bright morning in early spring they were finally ready to announce it. They called it the Bricklayer Foundation. Michael had chosen the name himself, and when Reginald first heard it, he had smiled and said nothing because he understood exactly what it meant, even if the rest of the world would spend years asking about it. The foundation had one purpose, and Michael had written that purpose himself in his own plain handwriting on the very first page of its charter: to find the people the world has overlooked and to lift them up expecting nothing in return. It was not a small thing. Michael had put a staggering amount of his own fortune into it, more money than most people could comprehend, and he had structured it so that it would keep running long after he was gone. But the money, Michael insisted, was the least important part. What mattered was the mission. The foundation would fund scholarships for young people from the kind of neighborhood Nathan had grown up in, and Michael had grown up in the kind of neighborhood with holes in the coats and never quite enough on Friday nights. It would provide mentorship, real mentorship pairing struggling young people with adults who had walked the same hard road and come out kind. And it would run a program, Michael's favorite part, that specifically sought out the workers that companies overlooked, the Rosas and the Terrences and the Walts, and it would fund their education, their advancement, their dreams, the ones they had long since stopped daring to have. On the morning of the announcement, there was a small ceremony at the company headquarters. Michael had refused anything larger. He did not want a gala. He did not want 300 wealthy guests in a gilded ballroom. He had seen where that kind of gathering led. Instead, he invited the people who actually mattered to him. Rosa Mendez was there, and she was no longer refilling coffee stations because Michael had personally seen to it that she was given the opportunity to train for the accounting role she had quietly wanted for 15 years, but had never been allowed to pursue. Terrence Boyd was there, promoted now to head of facilities for the entire building, a man who walked those halls with a new kind of straightness in his back. Walt Henderson was there, 22 years of loyalty, finally recognized his salary, corrected his title, honored a man who had spent 2 decades being invisible and was now at long last seen. And David Okafor was there. David had come back from Ohio. He had taken the job Michael offered him over the phone, the one with the promotion. And in the months since he had become something of a legend within the company, not because of anything he did at work, though his work was excellent, but because everyone knew his story. Everyone knew that the intern Nathan Whitmore had broken, had come back, and that the man who had broken him was gone, and that the founder himself had made the call to bring him home. David stood near the front, a young man who had almost given up on himself, and when Michael caught his eye across the room, David mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." And Michael shook his head gently because he did not want to be thanked, and he mouthed back 2 words of his own, "Welcome home." Emily was there, of course. She had left her old job entirely, and to no one's surprise, she had come to work for the foundation, running the mentorship program, spending her days connecting broken young people with adults who could show them a different way. She had found in the wreckage of a wedding that never happened the work she was actually meant to do, and she wore every single day on a chain around her neck her grandfather's old pocket watch, the one that had been broken on the marble floor of that ballroom, the one Michael had had repaired, and then on the morning she started at the foundation pressed into her hands. "It's yours now," he had told her. "Character over comfort. Your grandfather lived it. I tried to live it, and now it's your turn to carry it." Diane was there, standing proudly beside her husband of 32 years, watching the empire he had built quietly for 3 decades finally do out loud the thing it had always been meant to do. And there was one more person there, someone whose presence made the whole room go quiet when they realized who it was. Nathan Whitmore. He was not there as an executive. He would never be an executive at Whitmore Global again, and he had never asked to be. He was there because Michael had invited him personally, and because in the 4 months since that afternoon in the modest kitchen, Nathan Whitmore had done something that almost no one who knew the old Nathan would have believed possible. He had actually changed. It had not been dramatic. There had been no single moment of transformation, no lightning bolt, no scene. It had been slow and quiet and unglamorous, which is the only way real change ever actually happens. Nathan had taken a job, a genuinely humble one, at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated men re-enter the workforce. He had taken it because it was the only place that would hire a man whose name had become a punchline, and he had stayed because, to his own astonishment, he had discovered that he was good at it, and more than that it filled something in him that the executive suite never had. He spent his days now with men the world had thrown away, men that everyone assumed had nothing to offer, and one by one he helped them find work and dignity and a second chance, the same second chance that Michael Carter had given him in a modest kitchen over a bowl of soup. He had learned the name of everyone in his office building. Everyone. The security guard, the cleaning staff, the woman who ran the little coffee cart in the lobby. He knew their names, and he knew their children's names, and he greeted every one of them every single morning, not because it would get him anything, because it never would, but because he finally understood that this was what a person was supposed to do. And his mother had changed alongside him exactly as Michael had predicted. Vivian Whitmore, who had spent 61 years terrified of poverty and teaching that terror to her son, had begun volunteering of all places at the shelter where Emily spent her Saturdays. The 2 women had not become friends. Exactly. The wound was too fresh for that, but they had reached a kind of quiet peace, 2 people who had both loved Nathan and both watched him fall, and both in their own ways been changed by it. At the ceremony, Michael Carter stood up to speak. He did not have notes. He never had notes. He simply looked out at the small crowd of people who mattered to him, and he began to talk in the same plain, warm voice he used for everyone, whether they were a billionaire or a taxi driver. "Most of you know the story of how this foundation came to be," Michael said. "It's not a pretty story. It started at a wedding with an act of cruelty in front of 300 people. Many of you have read about it. Some of you were there." A soft, knowing murmur moved through the room. And I know that a lot of people, when they tell that story, they tell it as a story about justice. The poor-looking old man turns out to be the rich and powerful founder, and the cruel young man gets what's coming to him. And I understand why people love that version. There's something satisfying in it, the arrogant man brought low. Michael paused. "But I want to tell you today that I have come to believe that version of the story is wrong." The room went still. Because if the lesson of that day is simply that you should be kind to poor-looking people because they might secretly be rich, then we've learned nothing at all, Michael said. We've just learned to be afraid. We've just learned that anyone could be powerful, so we'd better be careful. And that's not kindness, that's calculation. That's the exact same disease that destroyed the young man at my daughter's wedding, just pointed in a slightly different direction. He shook his head. No. The real lesson of that day, the only lesson worth taking from it, is much simpler and much harder. It is this: that old man in the cheap suit deserved kindness. Not because he was secretly rich. He deserved kindness because he was a human being. He would have deserved exactly the same kindness if he had been exactly what everyone assumed: he was a poor man with nothing in his pockets but a broken watch and a letter to his daughter. The tragedy of that wedding was never that a powerful man got insulted. The tragedy was that we live in a world where a person's worth is measured by the suit they wear, and where a man in a cheap coat can be thrown into the street while 300 good people watch and say nothing. Nathan Whitmore stood at the back of the room, and his eyes were wet, and he did not look away because he had earned the right at last to hear this without flinching. "This foundation," Michael continued, "does not exist to reward the overlooked because they might secretly be valuable. It exists because they are already valuable. Every single one of them. The intern who made a mistake, the woman refilling the coffee, the man in the parking garage, the security guard nobody ever learned the name of. They were valuable the whole time. They were valuable before anyone important noticed them, and they'll be valuable long after. And the only thing that ever changed was that for one moment at one wedding, the world was forced to see it. My only goal with whatever years I have left and whatever fortune I've been lucky enough to build is to make the world see it more often. That's all. That's the whole thing." He looked out at the room at Rosa and Terrence and Walt and David, at his daughter with the watch around her neck, at his wife, and finally, last of all, at Nathan. "There's a young man here today," Michael said, "whose name most of you know, and whose story most of you have judged, and I understand why. But I want to tell you something about him, because I think it's the most important thing I'll say all morning." He held Nathan's gaze across the whole room. 4 months ago, this young man did something I have almost never seen anyone do. He hit the bottom, and instead of clawing his way back to who he was, he had the courage to become someone new. He did not do it to get anything back. He knew there was nothing to get back. He did it because he finally understood who he wanted to be. And I have watched him quietly over these 4 months keep choosing it every single day when no one was watching, and there was nothing in it for him. And I want to say in front of all of you that the measure of a man is not the worst thing he ever did on his worst day. The measure of a man is what he does after. And by that measure, this young man has more character today than he ever had when he had everything. Nathan Whitmore put his hand over his mouth, and his shoulders shook, and he wept openly in a room full of people who had every reason to despise him, and not one of them despised him in that moment, because they had all just watched the man he had wronged the most stand up and offer him grace in front of the world. The ceremony ended not long after, and as the small crowd mingled, Nathan made his way slowly through the room until he reached Michael. And the two men stood face to face, the founder and the fallen executive, 4 months and a whole lifetime removed from the wedding that had brought them here. "I don't know how to thank you," Nathan said, "for any of it, for the soup, for the second chance, for what you just said. There aren't words. Then don't thank me, Michael said, smiling. You know how this works now, Nathan. You don't pay it back, you pay it forward. And from what I hear, you already are. How many men have you helped find work now? 31, Nathan said quietly. 31 since I started. 31, Michael repeated, and there was real pride in his voice, the kind a father has. 31 men that the world threw away and you picked them up. Do you understand what that means? You've already helped more people in 4 months than you hurt in 6 years. You're not paying off a debt anymore, son. You're running a surplus. Nathan laughed through his tears, a real laugh. And then he said the thing he had come more than anything to say. Mr. Carter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if it hurts. The wedding, everything that happened, if you had it to do over again, if you could go back and stop it, spare Emily the pain, spare yourself the humiliation, spare all those people you helped from ever having been hurt in the first place. Nathan's voice was steady now. Would you undo it? Michael Carter considered the question for a long moment. It was a serious question, and it deserved a serious answer, and Michael had never once given his daughter or anyone else a dishonest one. No, he finally said. No, Nathan, I wouldn't. Nathan's eyes widened slightly. And I want to be very careful about what I mean by that, Michael said, because it would be a terrible thing to say if I meant it the wrong way. I would give anything to spare Emily the pain she felt that day. Anything. If I could have taught her the truth about you some gentler way, I'd have taken it in a heartbeat. So let me be clear. I'm not glad you were cruel. I'm not glad anyone was hurt. A better world is one where none of it ever happened at all. He put his hand on Nathan's shoulder. But that's not the world we live in. In the world we live in, you were who you were, and that cruelty was already inside you, and it was going to come out somewhere someday, one way or another. And I have come to believe that it is better, far better, for a thing like that to come out into the light where it can be seen and named and healed than to stay hidden in the dark, festering for years and years until it destroys a marriage or a family or a whole life. That wedding didn't create the cruelty in you, Nathan. It revealed it. And revealing it, painful as it was, is the only thing that ever gave you the chance to become the man you are today. So no, I wouldn't undo it, because undoing it would mean undoing you, the real you, the one who's helped 31 men, and that man is worth more than a wedding. Nathan Whitmore stood there, and he understood finally and completely everything that Michael Carter was and everything he had been trying to teach from the very first moment he had walked into that ballroom in a cheap Navy suit. You knew, Nathan said softly, that whole day. When I was screaming at you, when I had security drag you out, when I called your father's watch garbage. You knew who you were the entire time. You could have stopped it with one sentence. You could have said your name and watched me collapse. And you didn't. You let me do the whole thing. Why? Why would you let yourself be humiliated like that when you could have ended it in a second? And Michael Carter smiled the same calm, patient smile he had smiled at the doors of the ballroom 4 months ago. The smile that had made an old investor whisper, God help this boy. Because Nathan, Michael said, if I had said my name, you would have fallen to your knees and apologized, and you would have meant it, and you would have learned absolutely nothing. You wouldn't have been sorry for what you did. You'd have been sorry for who you did it to. And that's not remorse. That's fear. I've watched fear masquerade as remorse my whole life, and it never once changed a single soul. So I stayed quiet. I let you show me and Emily, and everyone in that room, exactly who you were when you believed I was nobody. Because the only version of you that could ever actually change was the version that got caught being cruel to a man who couldn't do anything for him and had to sit with that all the way down to the bottom until he understood it in his bones. Michael squeezed his shoulder one last time. I didn't stay silent to humiliate you, son. I stayed silent to save you. It was the hardest, most expensive gift I've ever given anyone. And judging by those 31 men, it might also have been the best. Nathan could not speak. He simply reached out, and Michael Carter, the man he had thrown into the street, pulled him into an embrace, and the two of them held on the wealthy man who had spent his life pretending to be poor, and the poor man who had spent his life pretending to be wealthy, both of them finally exactly who they truly were. Across the room, Emily watched, and her hand went to the pocket watch at her throat, and she felt her grandfather in it, the bricklayer she had never met, and her father in it, and now somehow even a little bit of Nathan, the man she had almost married and had walked away from and had watched from a careful distance become someone new. She would never marry him. That chapter was closed forever, and she had no regrets about closing it. But she was glad, deeply and truly glad, that the boy with the holes in his coat had finally been found. The years that followed proved Michael Carter right about everything. The Bricklayer Foundation grew into one of the most respected organizations of its kind in the entire country. It sent thousands of overlooked young people to college. It transformed the way the company treated its own workers, and then, as its reputation spread, it began to change the way other companies treated theirs. The story of the wedding, which had started as a piece of viral gossip about a rich man's revenge, slowly transformed over the years into something else entirely, a story that people told their children, a story about what a person is actually worth. Rosa Mendez became a senior accountant. Terrence Boyd sent both his kids to college with a scholarship from the foundation. Walt Henderson retired with honor and a pension that let him spend his final years comfortable and seen. David Okafor rose through the company and eventually left to start his own, and the first thing he did, the very first thing, was establish a policy that no intern in his company would ever be spoken to the way Nathan had once spoken to him. Nathan Whitmore never returned to wealth. He never wanted to. He ran that little nonprofit for the rest of his working life, and he helped by the end more than 2,000 men the world had given up on. And when he died, many years later, an old man himself, the church could not hold all the people who came to say that he had saved them. Not one of them knew him as the executive who had thrown an old man out of a wedding. They knew him only as the kind man who had given them a second chance when no one else would, which was in the end exactly the way Michael Carter had known him too. And Michael Carter himself lived a long, full life, and he drove the same kind of old car until the day he could no longer drive, and he ate at the same small diner, and he never once, not for a single day, forgot the bricklayer who had raised him or the 3 words engraved on the back of a watch he had passed to his daughter: character over comfort. When people asked him near the end what he was most proud of, they always expected him to name the company or the foundation or the fortune. And he never did. He would smile that same patient smile, and he would say that the thing he was most proud of was a single afternoon in a modest kitchen when a broken young man showed up at his door with $5 flowers, and he had a choice between revenge and grace, and he chose grace, and it turned out to be the best investment he ever made. Because here is the truth that Michael Carter spent his whole life proving the truth that outlived him and his company, and even the foundation that bore his father's trade. A person's worth is not the suit they wear or the car they drive or the number in their bank account or the title on their door. A person's worth is not even the worst thing they ever did on their worst day. A person's worth is measured by one thing and one thing only: how they treat someone they believe can do nothing for them. And any man who learns that lesson, no matter how late, no matter how hard the fall it takes to teach him, has learned the only thing in this life that was ever truly worth knowing.